there, it's Dan Kenner with another episode of The Casual Author. Today is Monday, October 2nd, 2023, as I record this, and this is episode number 91 of the podcast. Today we're talking to Seth Ring about world building, how to go about it, how to frame your mind around the topics, and how he has leveraged his world building skills to write his many books. I think he's published around 25 books to date. So you want to stick around for that conversation. We have a really amazing discussion around elements of world building, why it's important, and what are some pitfalls of world building, which is something that I don't think we get to talk about often as authors. But before we get to the interview, of course, we like to talk about updates. So that I feel like so much happens in a week that I have so many things to say, but at the same time, you probably don't want to hear about all of the crazy things that we're doing. Of particular note, we this last weekend, we had a pretty busy weekend. So my parents were in town, which was absolutely loved having them come over. We also had there was an event for our church that was going on. So that consumed in a positive way a lot of time. But chickens, I feel like you're hearing all about the chickens all the time, but the reality is there's a lot that goes into chicken care. So we have these two chicken tractors, just a portable coop. Essentially, they're just these peaked roofs. There's some tin roofing to protect them, of course, from the elements. They work amazing. But, they ran out of ground. So they're in this electric fence out in our fields, and they ran out of space, which means I had to move that really long electric fence. I want to say it's around 200 feet or so of electric fence. And so, I had to mow down the grass and try to measure it so that I didn't have to keep remowing, and moving them took way longer than I wanted to. But they are now moved into a new section. They are happy as can be. There's a lot more grass and weeds and things that they're just mowing down. That's why you move them, because they just graze. They'll eat all the bugs. They'll scratch everything up. They kind of prepare it to plant. I don't know if we're going to be planting there, but when we get a cow, minimally, at least the grass will come up thicker when their manure fertilizes it and everything. But yeah, I moved that fence, and it was more trouble than I expected it to be, because we designed these chicken tractors to have wheels to make it easier to move, right? In theory, that should make it easier. Well, we didn't buy the big enough wheels. We thought, hey, there are these plastic. They're relatively sturdy, but they're not really sturdy. I don't know if they were lawnmower extra wheels or something, but they're quite small. And so the chicken tractors don't move as well as they have. One of the wheels kept getting jammed on the roofing, which extended a little bit too far. I kept getting caught. I tried to bang the roofing down, didn't work. Anyway, so I had to muscle those things across the yard. Needless to say, the chickens had a less great time. None of them got hurt. They weren't overly stressed, but they didn't love the process of being moved. We don't want our chickens to go out and free, because the fencing in our property is not secure enough for chickens. Larger animals wouldn't get out. But, it's some barbed wire fence. Chickens are just going to go right through that. And we don't really want chickens to disappear and never come back. So I left them in the tractor while I moved it. I can imagine it was quite comical, but yeah, they're happy now that I opened the tractor and they're free to go. We also got another automatic door. If you're going to get chickens, get that automatic door. It's so much easier. So it's got a solar panel and a light sensor. And so when the sun gets too dark or goes down too far, then it'll shut the door automatically. Now, the chickens naturally know to go into their home. They don't like being out in the dark. So as things get dark, they go in that door before it gets too dark and the door closes. It opens automatically too. So when I go out in the morning, they're already out and about and having a blast. So definitely worth the money. Prior to that, I had to manually open the door, let them out, manually close it at night. And I do appreciate the exercise, but the field is pretty large, so it takes a while to walk out there and then walk all the way back. Someday we'll have four-wheelers to help with that, but for now, it's just walking. Other than that, the goats are just thriving. Their winter coats are starting to pack on. They're really looking fluffy. It's funny when they get really fluffy. Looks like they gain tons and tons of weight, but it's just their fur fluffing out. Our nights are getting down in the mid to low 30s, and so they're starting to pack it on because they're cold, which means we're going to need to feed them more. That's how they keep warm. They eat more. That warms up their internal body temperature. We've been preserving things like crazy. This last week, we preserved some of the 200 pounds of tomatoes, wrong vegetable, tomatoes that we got that are still ripening. We had to kind of panic pick them this last week because there was a frost in the forecast, and we didn't want them to get lost by the frost. That is unintentionally poetic. So we gathered 200 pounds of unripe tomatoes. They're currently sitting in boxes around our house, which is great. And they are ripening over time. But excited. We didn't think we got any tomatoes because our garden was just greenery, tons of greenery. We've just been watering it, not really tending too well to it. So my wife thought, oh, there's no tomatoes on those. But when we actually got into it, reached through all of the greenery, all the foliage, surprise, there's 200 pounds of tomatoes, and that's only half the plants. So we've been rapidly trying to store things, prepare them so that they don't go to waste. Great problem to have, but at the same time, we've had a lot of late nights because we have been preserving all of this food. Times and seasons, we're looking forward to the winter where we don't milk, we take a break from milking, and the garden preservation goes down to nothing. So looking forward to that time. I don't believe there's any other updates from the homestead perspective. So we'll jump over to the author updates. Last week, I talked about potentially completing the edits for the third book of the Cyber City in 1 week. That was hilariously lofty of a goal. I think I was just trying to give myself motivation to dive in, and I've dived in and I've made a lot of progress on it. I'm not quite done. I think the last and final that was redundant. The last step is to get it through Pro Writing Aid. So I'm taking the third book of Cyber City and putting it through Pro Writing Aid right now. It's cleaner than the other two, which is very positive. So I hope that means it's going to go a little bit faster. Once I complete that and pass it back to my co-author, kind of for the proofreading final stages, then those books should be ready to publish at the end of this year. So on target with those. I was a little bit worried that I was slowing her up with my slow editing process. Part of what slowed me up was that short story. So the Seduction of Thieves is the name of the story that I've written, and that has been officially submitted to Writers of the Future. We'll see what happens. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm not really holding my breath for anything. If I win the competition, I will never complain about having a little bit more author fund to put into marketing. But if I don't, I'm planning on doing more with this story. The current plan is to write a short story per quarter to submit to Writers of the Future as not necessarily, once again, I'm always trying to win, but more so that I can be gathering these short stories to do something with them. I believe that the next course of action is to start writing short stories about the Lightbearer Chronicles, the side characters. I've got so many characters to choose from, so I'm just going to write and write and write. Hopefully that'll rein in my ideas, because while I loved writing The Seduction of Thieves, it opened up this new realm of, well, now I want to write an entire 10-book series off of this, which I may do someday. But The Seduction of Thieves will be kind of the prequel story. I'm intending on either giving it away for free or adding it as a collection of stories to entice people to my reader list. So that is the current plan with that. And then it's to Dragonblooded. So I have a strategy, because I don't like editing. I have a strategy for diving into Dragonblooded and not wanting to pull my hair out, because I don't love editing. I don't love clicking through all the comments. We'll see if it goes well. I'll let you know after if it does, but hopefully that'll give me the motivation and courage to dive into Dragonblooded. I've also been dabbling with AI for covers. I know there's lots of controversy around here. I don't intend on using AI for my full-length novels, but for short stories, it's one of those things where I don't necessarily have the means to, especially if I'm writing lots of short stories, pay a very expensive cover artist for a short story of 15 to 20,000 words, especially if I'm writing them often. So I'm looking at AI, turning those into covers. I know they're not technically copyrightable, but I'm going to look into how to edit those covers myself, put elements together, blur things out, just kind of combine them without leveraging AI completely. So that's the plan. I'm going to try to build that skill set so that I can cover the short stories that I'm going to be writing. But yeah, all the fun things from the author perspective. I've also tried to be a little bit more disciplined about YouTube. So you can also find, if you're not on YouTube already watching this, if you're listening on a podcast platform, I am uploading them to YouTube with the fun video. You get to see me and the person I'm interviewing. We have a blast. So you get to see who's talking. It's always fun to see, voice to face. It's always one of the fun revelations, especially if you have an idea of what they look like and it's completely wrong from what they actually look like. So take a look at YouTube, give that a go. I think you'll really enjoy it there. They are the same, with the exception of YouTube. I do not have, if you're on YouTube, you know this, I don't have the kind of beginning sequence where I talk a little bit more about the casual author. At some point, I'll combine those, but I'm a casual author. I don't have time for everything. So one thing at a time. That has been a, lower priority. So we'll get to it when we get to it. But I believe that's everything from an author perspective. So we can go ahead and shift over to the interview with Seth. Hey, Seth, how are you doing today?
I am doing so well, Dan. It is a pleasure to be here.
I am excited to have you. There's a lot of things that I want to ask you, and I'm excited to have this conversation because world building is something that I absolutely love. I'm an epic fantasy author, and so the whole world building aspect is some of my favorite parts of the writing process. Before we dive into the fun parts, though, how long have you been writing and publishing?
I have been publishing since 2018. I've been writing since about 2015.
Okay, excellent. So I understand that you are a full-time author currently. Is that correct?
I am. Yes.
At what point did you transition over to that point, or were you that from the beginning?
No, in 2019, I was at the end of 2019, I was about to transition into full-time, and COVID happened shortly thereafter.
Yes.
And so I had been prepping for it, and COVID happened, and I was like, well, maybe I'll wait because I don't know what's going to happen here. And so 2021 was when I made the jump. I had been working a sales job for an IT company, and
Nice.
Eventually just transitioned over in like April, I think, of 2021.
And I'm assuming you haven't regretted it because
I
you're still
have
here.
not. I have not regretted it. It has been it was a great choice. It was a great choice.
Yeah, I think that's the dream of a lot of authors out there. But I think it's important to recognize that you mentioned preparing for it.
Yes.
And I don't think that was a small feat. Yes, extensively. So how long did you take the time to prepare? I mean, I know there was a little hiccup with COVID, but
yeah.
What did that look like?
Yeah, so if I'm being honest, I started preparing at the beginning of 2018. I mentioned I published at the end of 2018 was my first book. But I come from the web serial world. So I was posting my writing on like amateur writing websites.
Nice.
And I was slowly building out a backlog of material and sort of testing my concepts and my books with a live audience. And I had been doing that for some years. And so in the beginning of 2018, that's when I finally thought, I could maybe make a shot of this. I don't know what's going to happen, but I can at least try. And over that next year, I prepped by getting all of my books in as polished a state as I could, and actually having multiple books sort of ready to go. And I set up a number of sort of the marketing pieces, apparatuses that I use still to this day, and deployed all of that at the end of 2018. And then 2019 was really just making sure that the concepts worked and that it was sustainable long term. And then the other piece was saving up as much money as I possibly could, just to make sure that I had enough sort of breathing room, a long enough runway that even if I didn't get off the ground, I was going to be okay. And I could have time to go back and get a job and, call up my old boss and be like, hey, it didn't work. So can I have my job back? So I had a lot of that sort of planned out ahead of time. And, I feel very blessed that it did work. Through COVID, I kept my job and I continued to just sort of work at both things, writing and also my sales job. And then in 2021, as things were starting to shift out of the pandemic mindset, I was like, okay, this is the time, this is the opportunity I have, right? I'd managed to save up a little bit more money and was just in a place where it worked for our family for me to be home all of the time and also writing. And so, again, feel very blessed to have been able to make that transition.
Absolutely. We could go into so many details, but we're not going to, because we have world building to talk about.
That's right.
Just hearing your story, I think because there's a lot of people who, everybody, I think the first thing to note is that everybody's experience is very different, right?
Yes.
Everybody's circumstances are very different. There are some things that are similar, but I know that it can be discouraging for some authors who want to reach where you have, and they haven't gotten there for various reasons. And I think that's okay, right? Comparison is the thief of joy. we've heard that before, and it is. I think learning from your example, it's encouraging to know, hey, there's other authors who can make it. And just clarification, you are independently published, correct?
I am, yeah.
Okay.
Well, so the first 10 books that I released were independently published.
Okay, perfect.
I have since started releasing some of my series with a small press.
Nice. Okay.
Simply because they allow me to write more.
Mm-hmm.
So sort of weighing that trade-off. But I'm actually probably in the process of going back to some independent publishing.
I actually am right in the same place where I'm trying to noodle around with small press or continue independent, because I love independently publishing. The time spent is a lot more. It's so much
yes.
Time in that.
That's a lot.
So there's something that would be nice about like just writing and send off to some degree. I mean, there's trade-offs, but
there are absolutely trade-offs, and there's no right path.
Right.
It's, it's all about what works for you and your context and your situation.
Absolutely. So I'll keep thinking. Maybe I'll pick your brain about the small press experience and the comparison, because as of today, I've technically only independently published. I have a trilogy that I've co-written that is going to be published with the small press. Okay. My co-author is actually the owner of that small press, so
cool.
That's the reasoning behind it. Anyway, great experience. I loved co-authoring. I would definitely do it again. Yeah. But world building. So I think many readers, specifically sci-fi and fantasy readers, can say that the world that we're in is probably some of the favorite parts of the reading and writing aspect. So for you, why do you care so much about world building? Why have you studied so much about it?
So I first fell in love with stories because they could transport me to another world. Mm-hmm. And what I found as I matured as a reader is I kept wondering more and more, what's in that direction? What's outside of the bounds of this story? I wonder what it would be like to live in this place. And what intrigued me the most were worlds where I could imagine myself living in them. Mm-hmm. And so as I got older and as I started to read sort of more mature books, I started to really try to understand the mechanics of what puts a good world together. And then as I transitioned into a writer, I sort of brought that love of world building with me. And then I have had the fortune of a friend who has a lot of similar interests in that specific regard. What makes a good world tick? And he happens to be an engineer. And so he's got some great perspectives on sort of the mechanics of how systems are put together. And we just started talking about it a lot. And the more I've delved into this topic of world building, the more I find I love it.
It sounds like the love, kind of the trail that I fell into as well. I only started writing because of reading, but I totally agree. Mm-hmm. There's something to be said about forgetting where you are while you're reading. Absolutely. It's such a great feeling, right? Now it happens less and less these days, primarily because I'm squeezing in reading times between children needing diaper changes and on a work meeting, but it still can happen, right? And that world building aspect is so important, particularly in certain genres, right? Now, world building is important in all genres, but some I feel like lean heavier into it. Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantasy.
Kind of the things you write, fantasy, sci-fi.
Yeah, sci-fi. A lot of that stuff really does rely on the reader being able to construct the world in their head, because because the worlds have a greater degree of separation from the real world, it requires more lifting on the part of the reader in order for them to, suspend their disbelief, for them to be immersed into it. And
I think this is perfect. Keep going.
Okay. So that feature of like, these worlds need to be explained more. I think authors have had to find sort of shorthand ways to deliver that experience without just pages and pages and pages of exposition saying, this is the world that you're inhabiting now. You need to be able to deliver that in a way that grabs the reader, that doesn't slow the pace of the story you're trying to tell, but also does the work or helps them do the work of constructing this world.
Yeah, the reason I'm so excited that you brought this up, like this is a great place to start for me, is, you know, this is something that I'm very passionate about as well, because I have read maybe not as many books as like someone who has read thousands of books, but I've read a lot of books, and I'm actually pretty picky about the way the things are written, because I do think that once you've reached past the limit for my brain of explanation, then I just don't care anymore.
Yeah.
It's just like, you know what, I don't care. I'm discarding this information. You know, it's just
Right.
not
It's just not
helping.
relevant.
And so I think that's an
Yeah.
important place, and it's hard to reach. And I think that people might worry too much about this because I think it's a pretty big scale to work with.
Yes.
But I have read some books where when there's 3 paragraphs about one person's apparel, what they're wearing,
Right.
I don't care. Like, frankly, I
Yeah.
don't care. Like, I'm not
Right.
going to remember all of those details. It's so much more enjoyable for me when I'm allowed to fill in those details with my
That's
imagination.
exactly right.
And I think that's the way you described it. And I think some of that comes to the writer, the author, trusting their reader to bring their imagination to the table and filling
absolutely.
that in.
Absolutely. You know, writing books and reading books, it's a strange partnership, because the author has to be able, like you said, to trust the reader, that the reader is really going to take their story and is going to do something wonderful with it. And the reader, in some regards, needs to trust that the author is taking them somewhere, which is one of the reasons that when an author commits sort of the cardinal sin of not delivering on what they've promised, readers get so upset, right? Because there is an exchange happening. Every time you pick up a book and you start to read it, you're sort of accepting the commitment of the author to deliver whatever it is that they've said they're going to deliver, by their cover, by their back matter, by their the blurb. Like, all of those things communicate something. And as you open it up and as you start to read the first few pages, the world building is the thing that I think tells you what kind of story you're going to get. And so being able to understand how to communicate properly in that language, I think, is a real skill that an author can cultivate.
So I think this is the tricky question, though. A couple tricky questions. How do you know you've reached that balance, right? How do you know that you haven't added too much exposition where you're stripping their imagination's ability to actually fill in those blanks?
Man, that is a really good question. And
exact word count, Seth. Come on. Exact. No, I'm just kidding.
It probably has to do with the genre that you're writing in.
Yeah, that's true.
It probably has to do with sort of reader expectation of the kind of book they're picking up. In epic fantasy, you're probably going to have a different kind of world building than in like a pulpy space opera, or in a fantasy romance. Like different genres or subgenres, even inside of fantasy or science fiction, are just going to have different levels of world building required, because the readers have different expectations for how much sort of lifting they're going to have to do. Part of the reason, though, that people love epic fantasy is because the worlds are so rich. You don't want it's very hard to hold the weight of an epic story if your world building is really thin. At the same time, really heavy world building in a fast, fantasy action book, like action adventure, it's the heavy world building can sometimes choke out the story, and because it's hard to keep the pacing when you're setting up the kingdoms and the lineages and like all of the lore around all of these different things that in an epic fantasy will matter, but in this action adventure story about slaying a dragon maybe don't matter quite so much. So I think you have to judge sort of based on what you're writing, how heavily you invest in that world building.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think I just want to kind of take a step back to that pacing issue, because I think
Mhm.
that's a really important piece of it. I love world building. I do like exposition to some degree, but I
Mhm.
would much rather that exposition delivered with plot going throughout it,
Yes.
building up over slow periods of time than an entire prologue with absolutely no dialogue and absolutely no plot points at all. It's like
Right.
it's just it's hard because it doesn't feel real. I think that's where it comes
Right.
down for me, is
Yeah. It feels
the irony of that, right? This fake
right.
world doesn't feel real. But I mean, it's in truth, when you
Yes.
have this great environment with nothing to react to that environment, one, you
Yeah.
forget. Two, it just doesn't feel real. But when you've got actual
Yep.
characters and people responding and behaving and changing the way they do things
Right.
because of this environment, suddenly it's like, oh wow, that's important, right? I know
Mhm.
that's important because X character just almost got eaten by an alligator or whatever,
Right.
whatever it is. So
Yeah, it's the same as when you would sit in history class and your teacher would be like flipping through the book and droning on about the thing, right? And you don't remember any of that history. But then you go on a field trip and you tour a battlefield or you tour a castle or you tour something and you learn all of these, they drip feed all of the history throughout the experience. And because the experience is there to anchor the memories, you learn. And years later, you can just recite facts about some random historical thing when you can't remember it. At least I can't remember a thing from any of my high school classes on history. You
no,
know, and I think it's the same thing. I think it's as soon as we tie people to events, they just become more memorable.
mhm. Absolutely. I think this is a perfect example, and it's very potent to me because I actually, whenever I tell people this, I was like, what? I really dislike history primarily because of my experience in schooling, right?
Sure.
I've been to a lot of historical sites across the United
Mm-hmm.
States, and I loved each of those experiences. I was never bored. I was always fascinated by all of those things. And I remember those experiences way more than X
Right.
date is when X happened, or this
Right.
general's name did X. I'm like, I don't know. It was in a textbook. I don't remember.
Right.
But yeah, I think that's a very perfect example of that. Now, the tricky thing is finding that balance. And I want to bring
Yeah.
this up only because this doesn't directly relate, but it can. So do you find yourself on more of the discovery writing scale or more of the plotting
Mm.
scale?
100% on the discovery writing.
Okay.
I've recently been trying to plot
Mhm.
because I'm recognizing some of sort of the weaknesses in my stories and I'm trying to remedy those. And plotting seems like a good way to do that. But the reality is that if you gave me a completed outline, I would not be able to write that book because I've already read the book.
Yep.
I know what's going to happen. I
Yes.
don't need to write it.
You and I think very similar. That is
Yeah.
exactly why I have not formally plotted. Now, have I
Right.
thought ahead in my stories? Absolutely.
Right.
But yes, I agree. There's the factor of if I wrote out a plot, I wouldn't write that book. I'd write a different one
Yeah.
because I want something that's interesting and fresh and new. But I
Hmm.
think, we may have to invite a plotting world builder into this
Yeah.
at some
Right.
point because I don't have that perspective. I
Yeah.
think it can be possible. It's very possible.
So it's interesting because my friend James, who I mentioned that I have talked a lot about world building with, he is more of a plotter
Mhm.
in that when he sits down to design things, he really thinks about all of the pieces and wants to make sure everything works together. And will build out the entire system or sketch out the entire system before he commits to writing anything. And it's interesting though, because as we have talked about world building, we have sort of moved closer and closer and closer to the center of, and we talk about it in some regards like a garden. Um, you know, there are a lot of different kinds of gardens. You have the sort of the classic English garden that's all overflowing with all sorts of plants and it looks almost wild. And then you have French gardens, which are highly meticulously cared for, almost mathematical in their composition. And both are gardens, right? Both achieve different things, but both are gardens and they're designed to produce a feeling when you walk through them,
Mhm.
just different kinds of feelings, right? And so it's been interesting talking to him, because my perspective is like, let it grow, right? And if you need to uproot something, if you need to prune something, fine, no worries. You can do that later. Just let it grow. And his is more on the, let's plan this out. Let's understand what it is we're planting. Let's understand what it is we're growing so that the end result is right, And so it's been interesting just hearing those different perspectives, because again, there's no one way to do it. There's no right way to do it. It's how can you best get the story that's in your head out for other people to consume and communicate it, and deliver the experience that you're trying to deliver.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, I love that. I think the right way is the right way for you as an author, whoever you are, because I just know plotting, it doesn't work. I have dabbled in it and known really quickly, this isn't the way I can write. My brain will not function properly with this. But I think the reason that's important to bring up is because world building, as important as it is, can be applied at any part of the process. And it really, I think a lot of it does come from an author's intuition. Right. I think you as an author have read a lot of fantasy and sci-fi books. I have as well. And so you have a general sense of what you like as an author, as well as what details and what things bring you into the world in the right way. Now, it's every book's not the same, right? But I think generally the world building, the way you deliver it, can be similar in ways. And as you do more of it, you learn more, whether that's plotting out the world building or just writing as you go, which is what I do. I'm a pretty heavy discovery writer. So, in any case, so when you started working in your first books, what challenges did you run into at the beginning of your world building journey?
So the biggest challenge at the beginning was learning to say no to ideas, learning to say, this is a really good idea, but it's not for this book. Or this is a really good idea and I really want it to be for this book, but I'm not going to put it in. And learning how to limit the scope of what I was trying to do was really tough. I think that when you read a lot of first books, it's a pretty universal challenge that they are just packed full of everything. And it's because, as a new writer, you're having all of these great ideas. You're investing in this creative exercise for the first time. And your focus, at least my focus, was more on just exercising that creativity. Right. And so I was just sort of throwing everything into the mix. And it was like, hey, this would be cool if this happened. And this would be cool if this happened. And if there were dragons, that would be cool. And everything was just sort of getting crammed in. And so from a world building perspective, that is not a great way to make a coherent world. The more you add, the harder it becomes to maintain the lines that are going to keep someone immersed. Because every time you introduce a new thing, you're asking your reader to suspend their disbelief one step further. And so learning how to prune, learning how to just say, well, maybe I won't include these ideas, even though they're really cool. Maybe I'll save these for a later book, a later world. I think that was the biggest challenge.
I'm reflecting on that because I'm trying to think about my experience. And I think I can agree with that saying no, it's a skill that I think a lot of people need to develop. But I was thinking about all the first books that I've read, and I think I have sensed elements of that as well.
And if you can get a good editor, if you can get people to read your books, a lot of times they'll be like, oh, it's cool, but like, why do you need this stuff? Like, what's the purpose of this? Do you have a plan for these elements? And so it's possible, to get that counsel and have people help you slim down. But even now, I find it sometimes hard to stay the course with my idea, especially as a discovery writer, because it's like, oh man, I'm exploring this world, right? I like to talk about how occasionally my characters will just do things. So a great example of that is my first series which is 10 books long, and now I'm writing a continuation series, was supposed to be 3 books. And then at the end of the 3rd book, the main character did something insane. And I was like, oh no, what do I do? I guess I have to write another book. And one thing led to another. And now 16 books in the series. I guess I'm starting the 16th book in that world. And so, yeah, learning how to just keep that line and say, okay, I'm going to keep this and maintain it all the way through. It can be a challenge.
Well, and I'm going to go ahead and bring up the tracking of those details, because if you're a disorganized human like myself, I mean, behind me looks relatively organized for my normal day to day. But I'm curious to know, like, do you have any recommendations or things that you've been successful with in keeping track of these great things that you come up with as you're making these decisions?
So one of the things that I have started to do, and I started this a couple of years ago, is I have a specific notebook for, and it's got a sticker on it that says future bestsellers, sort of as a joke to me, because it's like, these are all of the ideas that I have mid-writing where I'm like, this is the greatest idea ever. And I know I can't trust myself because I will just chase that idea and not finish the book that I'm trying to work on. Mm-hmm. And so I write them down in as much detail as I need to stop thinking about them. Okay. And then I close the book and I say, when I'm finished, I will revisit those ideas. And what I find is that the best ones do sift out, right? They do sort of rise to the surface. They're the ideas that won't leave you alone, right? That, you know, as you're taking your shower, you find yourself suddenly thinking about that idea again. And so learning to sort of put those ideas down on paper, to make them concrete, and then to just put them away, that has helped me quite a bit in learning how to separate out what is good and what is not. Because sometimes I'll write out an idea and then I'll never think about it again until I'm flipping through the book. And then I'm like, that was kind of dumb. That wasn't a great idea. I'm just going to skip that one. Right. It remains in the book as a reminder to me that not all ideas are created equal, you know, and sometimes in the moment, excuse me while I get nerdy for just a second.
Love it.
So,
do it.
So one of the hallmarks of a flow state, which is sort of the optimal state that you enter into when you're doing a skill-based activity. And it's sort of it's sort of characterized by like time either extending or vanishing. And so if you've ever been working on something and you get just totally locked in and in the zone, that's a flow state. Well, one of the hallmarks of a flow state is that your decision-making goes haywire. And so it's impossible in the moment to tell if an idea is good or bad. And so knowing that, I tried to just never make decisions in the middle of writing, because I tend to be, as a discovery writer, very flow-based, right? Mm-hmm. I like it when I'm locked in the zone and time vanishes and I'm just writing and I don't know how long it's been. I love that state. But when I have an idea in that state, it's suspect, because the way our brains work, the sort of the chemical composition or the chemical cocktail that alerts you to when an idea is good or bad, it gets overridden by just a bunch of dopamine. And so when you come up with an idea, the dopamine is like, hey, this is a great idea. This is a really good thing. You should do it. But the reality is that you're not in sort of the mental state to make that decision. And so being able to take those creative moments as what they are and then set them aside and then step away and come back to it later when your brain is not in that chemically altered state, and actually judge whether it's going to fit with your story or not. I think that is sort of that's the skill that I've tried to cultivate to help me maintain my line in my story, to help me carry my initial idea, which I thought was good enough to write a whole book about, to carry that idea to the end.
Absolutely fascinating. But I have a really interesting question to kind of
Sure.
clarify that, because as a discovery writer, you don't go into each writing session having decided already what to write. Well, at least I don't.
Correct. Correct.
So
So
how can you distinguish between the
sure.
decisions that can be made in that flow state and
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
ones
Yeah.
cannot be made during that flow
So
state?
I have started, and this is partly because I just, as one of the challenges that people don't talk about as full-time writers is that I have to write.
Yeah.
Like my income depends on it. And so I don't, in a lot of ways, there's a cost, right? And that cost is that I have to produce words in a certain volume in a certain period of time.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be, as a discovery writer, that can be a real challenge, because my preferred state is to sort of just sit down and see what comes,
Mm-hmm.
right? And to just see how it flows. And then if I'm not feeling it, cool, no problem. I'll go do something else and I'll come back and I'll try again, right? When what I've realized, just from a like provide for my family, keep everything consistent on the financial side, is that I can't always do that. And so what I have ended up doing is that I will write a single sentence for every chapter that I'm going to write for the day. And that single sentence is just sort of a guide stone of like, this is approximately what I want to do. And then I sit down with that in mind, that sentence in mind, and I say, okay, I'm going to go through and I'm going to do it. And probably every once a week, at least, sometimes once a day, depending on what's going on during the week, I will sit down and I'll start writing. And then I'll be like, wouldn't it be cool if this happened? And then I look at that idea and I look at my one sentence outline and I'm like, I will have to throw away my whole outline. And if the idea is really cool, I will write it down and then I will let it sit for a day, right? And I will think about it and say, will this make sense sort of in the grand scheme of things? Now, on a micro scale, inside a chapter, I have no idea what's going to happen. I don't know. Like, I know that the characters have to get from point A to point B, but that's it. And how they get there or what happens along the way, who knows? And often what will happen is a new character will insert themselves and be like, hey, crisis, thing has to happen, problems. And my characters will be like, all right, let's go. And they'll just run away and go a totally different direction than I anticipated. And now I have the joy of solving that puzzle, of being like, how do I get them from that? And how do I resolve that? And how do I get them back to sort of where I need them to be to continue on with this story that I'm trying to tell, right? But it is a very fluid sort of thing, right? I don't have any, apart from the don't make decisions in the middle of flow, like in the middle of my writing session, just don't make the decision. Apart from that, I don't really have a lot of hard and fast rules. And so I'm happy to just write something, and then if it doesn't work, throw it away and come back and try again, right? So it's sort of a feel it out process, but I do like to have that touchstone of I have a single concrete idea going into this, right? Because I find that helps me get started. And for me, that getting started piece has always been a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. Obviously, we're two different people. Right. The challenges that you experienced are definitely not challenges I experienced. Granted, my this is probably not the best philosophy to have, but I don't like writing things down. It's just my own problem. And so I chalk it up to if I'm out in the shower or, digging up goat poop, because that's what I do a lot in a homestead, and I have an idea and I really, really like it. My philosophy is if I remember that idea when I get to the page, then it belongs in the book.
I
And
love that.
that's kind of my natural sifter, and it's worked for me so far. A lot of people are like, but what
Yeah.
if you need that idea later? I'm like, if I don't remember, then I don't need it. I have a pretty good memory, so I don't.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things like, oh, that'd be really cool. That'd be really cool. And then I just don't remember them. The ones that
Yeah.
belong in the book are the ones I remember when I get to the page. So probably not recommended. I think a lot of
I don't
people would be
know.
like, what? Don't do that. But that's what I
I
do.
I
So,
think I think that can be a trained thing though, right?
yeah, that's
You've
fair.
over time trained your mind how to understand the best ideas and to lock those ideas into your into your longer term memory. And so I think that's great. I think that's a fantastic way to do it. I don't again, I am constantly changing and refining my own process
Yeah.
because things change, life
Well, yeah.
changes,
So am I. I mean, I'm obviously learning as well. But
right.
one of the other things that you mentioned that is a challenge for you is getting started, and I don't
Yeah.
actually have that problem, which is great. I'm very grateful
Oh
for it.
man.
I can.
That's
I don't
nice.
know where I've developed this skill because it came out of nowhere. It's kind of the same with books. Like, there's a lot of people like,
Hmm.
if I get sucked into a book, I can't stop. I'm like, oh, I can. Like, I could just
Hmm.
put a placeholder in it in the middle of a chapter. I know it drives some people crazy. And then when I come
Hmm.
back to it, I'm just right back in. I don't have any hard challenges getting into it. And the same with writing.
Mm.
I do have to leave some breadcrumbs for myself if I'm stopping in the
Sure.
middle of the chapter. Be like, it has to end on an action scene or, something
Right. Something
like,
that you can
so
just
I
pick up.
remember, oh, that's right. This is where I was going. But yeah, it
Yeah.
really comes down to my brain being able to shift between activities and
Mm.
knowing, hey, it's time to write. Sometimes I'll have to listen to like one song, and that's enough to get me in the mood,
Right.
and suddenly, man, back into it.
So if I can ask you a question about that, in your general life, do you do a lot of mode switching? Like swapping from one task to another task to another task?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. Yes.
Because that's a skill that I I realized is something that I'm not great with.
Mm,
Being able to like put a like pin something and then come back to it later, and sort of be right there. That mode switching is something that I've just never been particularly skilled with.
yeah.
And I noticed it particularly after I started working from home because my wife is excellent as a mode switcher and she is constantly, moving from task to task to task. And it would drive me nuts to be like, I'm halfway through the dishes and now this kid needs something and that kid needs something. And I'm homeschooling and I have phone calls about, stuff coming in. And now I still have to go back and do the dishes. Like that would drive me crazy. So
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
recognize that there's a skill there that I assume you can learn, but because most skills you can learn. But that's a really interesting sort of way of approaching it. And it's certainly very different from how I approach it.
Well, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think it just
Right.
really chalked up the
Absolutely.
differences in authors because the one thing, there are some advantages to being able to switch. But
Hmm.
I will say that things get completed less quickly on that
Yeah.
front. So you might
Yeah.
be able to focus, get a project done. Whereas I don't have a hard time switching back and forth, but it's like doing a lot of things at the same time.
Right.
And so the completion of those things is kind of errant. It's not really
Yeah.
planned. But yours is like, oh,
Sure, sure.
I have this goal, I have this time period. It takes me a while to get into it, but I'm relatively confident that I'll complete that in that time
Yes.
period. And with me, it's
It's a
just like,
very structured
yeah.
sort of creativity.
So it's very different, right? And there's
Yeah,
nothing
it
wrong with
is.
that. But I think
Yeah,
the one thing to keep in mind, as whoever you are, is you do have to know what your strengths are, and you have to know what your
that's
weaknesses
right.
are, and play to those. Because what you're
Yeah.
doing obviously works for you. What I'm doing is currently working for me, but I do
Hmm.
understand that things could change. I mean, at any time,
Yeah.
things could change. So it's the
Yeah.
important piece of looking at it. But I will be completely transparent. I have not read any of your books. Sorry, I would
That's
like
okay.
to.
That's okay.
Now as
There
I've
are a lot of
dived,
books out there to read.
well,
Listen, there are a
yeah, that's
lot of
true.
books out there to read.
That's very true. But that's a good thing, right? I don't
It
see that as
is.
a
It's so
problem.
good.
I
It's
think
so good.
there's a lot of books, and for me, it really comes down to I like to help people out where possible. So I'm writing a lot of. I don't tend to beta read only because
Yeah.
I can't guarantee I can meet someone within a timeline once again. Switch
Yeah.
tasks, but maybe
That's
not
right.
respect the timeline for myself. But I do like to
Yeah.
read as many indie author books as possible. I just like really big world building books. So I'm excited to
Hmm.
take a look at yours and
Yeah.
And
hopefully you enjoy them.
I guarantee I'm not very picky. So I say that I was picky. I'm not generally picky. I do like to read anything as long as the writing is engaging and the pacing is appropriate.
Yes.
If the pacing fails, then I'm gonna have to set it aside. There have been some really
I'm right there with you.
I won't go into any names, but there's been some really mainstream popular books recently that I've tried to get into. I'm just like, oh, the pacing of this is atrocious. I can't. I need to. It just isn't working for me. So that's kind of fun on that front. But we won't get into that. We are running short on time. So before we end here, I want to make sure that you can share where people can find more information about you and your books and your podcast and everything.
Yeah, the easiest thing to do is just to look me up at sethring.com. If you're interested in world building, we have a world building podcast called the Worldcraft Club podcast. And it's on all major streaming platforms. And I run that with my co-host, James, who's a tremendous guy. But yeah, really just my website is probably the best place to find out information about me.
Absolutely love that. It's so much easier. I love when authors are everywhere, but sometimes it's challenging to be like, I'm here and here and here and here and here. I'm just like, okay, that's great. I'll put all those links in. But
what I tell people is just type Seth Ring into Google and I'll pop up.
Isn't that so great? I have reached that point where you can Google Dan Kenner and I'm going to be the first thing that pops up. I'm like,
I love that.
Encouraging. It's great. But thanks for your time. This has been great.
Absolutely. Been so fun.
Hey, I hope you really enjoyed that conversation. Seth and I really hit it off in there because I have a passion for world building. We both write fantasy. You know, he writes more sci-fi and lit RPG things as well. But it's one of those the realms that an author can really get stuck in, either a positive or a negative way. So really insightful. Check out his podcast. I really enjoyed listening to it. I know I think they have something like 60 some odd episodes. Definitely worth listening to if you're interested in world building. So next week, we will be talking to Katie Isley about how you can leverage your expertise in almost anything to bring validity to your writing. So Katie has a lot of expertise in medieval subjects as well as horse care. We talk about how she has leveraged that expertise to add that validity, put some more weight into her stories, and really bring the reader into the story, leveraging that. So there's all things you can do with that, any expertise that you have. And we just talk about that, how she did it, things that she learned, and whatnot. So you'll want to stick around for that. For that interview. The last thing I will say is I have secured the domain for The Casual Author. So you can now find podcast episodes at thecasualauthor.com. So definitely check out there if you want to find out more about the podcast. I'm going to be building that more over time. But yeah, once again, thecasualauthor.com is now a domain that you can search for the podcast. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to talking to you next week.